Hey everyone, Pastor George here with today's Bible study recap. And today we looked at First Peter 3, verses 8 through 22. Now, good stuff today. Basically, what Peter is doing here is he is picking up from where we left off last week. And the few weeks before that. So, for chapter 2 and the first part of chapter 3, there's a lot on submission, right? Submission to government, submission to from slaves to masters, submission wives to husbands, stuff like that, right? And this is where Peter kind of makes his case as to why these things are important, right? These weren't all just separate ideas. He's stringing these together. Basically, he's saying that you do all of these things, right, in order to build Christ's kingdom, right? You reach out and you make sure that you don't cause too much of a stir or too much trouble in order to win people to Christ. And that's something that a lot of us don't really like. But Peter has not a political vision in mind here, but a spiritual one, right? His whole goal is to try to get as many people saved as possible. And so he's not really worried as much about maybe some of the things that we would be worried about, even if those in those situations Peter is looking down on or thinks that people could be doing things better and stuff like that, right? Ultimately, a lot of this comes down to what we see in verse 13 here, where it says, "Who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good?" Right? And this is where Peter kind of shifts from submission to suffering, which is kind of going to fill out the rest of kind of First Peter 3 from 13 onward and into chapter 4 as well. And so he shifts to this suffering idea because the churches that he is writing to are experiencing persecution and suffering. I've talked about this in previous weeks. And this is kind of where he's getting at this idea here of like, you do good, you carry yourself, gently, sympathetically, lovingly, in order so that you can win people to Christ and in order that you don't get punished. But of course, Peter knows that even if you do good, you still could get punished, right? Which is why in verse 14, he says, but even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed, right? And that's really difficult for us because we usually like to see his blessing as only being something that is positive, something we want in the moment, but not something that is maybe good from God's perspective. But that is not what Peter is talking about here, right? He's thinking about ultimate goodness that rests in what God will do with our suffering, right? That suffering actually has a meaning and a purpose beyond just the sadness of life or whatever, right? So he says that we should even find blessing in suffering because that's something that Christ has gone through. And we know that if Christ has gone through it and has a resurrection body, then there's nothing that we have to fear, right? And so he gives us a good reason to think about that and talks about Christ's own death. And interestingly enough, this is where we get one of the few things that we look at when we talk about Christ descended into hell, right? Where in verse 19, Peter says, after being made alive, right, in the spirit, he went and made proclamation to the imprisoned spirits, right? So he went down into hell and talked to people who are in prison. We talked a little bit about who that might be, who that might not be. We don't really know. There's a lot of debate about who that is. All we know is that and even what he was proclaiming. Was he proclaiming salvation to them and kind of allowing them to get out? Was he proclaiming to them who he is? We don't really know. The church has been divided on how to interpret that for a long time. No one really, really knows for sure. You might have your own guess, and that's really fine. The point is that he goes down there and comes up, right? He is resurrected. And that's when Peter moves into the hope that we have through the resurrection parallel through our baptism and paralleled through the Noah story, right? Just like Noah and his family were saved from the flood, right? From God's judgment on sin and evil in the flood, so too are members of the church saved by being grafted into Christ. And baptism marks us as part of that family, which is saved from sin and evil in this world now, right? That we aren't judged and punished along with everyone else because we have been replaced, right, by Christ, who takes that punishment for us. And so, a lot of that punishment, right, suffering, this is something that Jesus has really experienced, and that's what Peter's going to talk about more next week. So we're gonna hit that more next week. But yeah, really interesting passage today. I look forward to moving on next week with all of you. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday, and peace out.